The dust-laden wind howled through the streets of Galesburg, Illinois, like a banshee announcing death's arrival. But all Ruby Keller could hear was the sound of her own screams as Deputy Marshal Frank Holloway dragged her by her auburn hair toward the sheriff's office. Her crime: standing up for an elderly Mexican shopkeeper, whom the lawman had been harassing over supposed unpaid taxes. Ruby's feet scraped helplessly against the hard-packed dirt of Main Street, her hands clawing at the deputy's iron grip, as curious and horrified onlookers gathered at the edges of the thoroughfare. It was 1878, and in the 7 years since she'd arrived in Galesburg to take over her late uncle's millinery shop, she'd never drawn such public attention to herself. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face. "I've done nothing wrong." Deputy Holloway only tightened his grip. "Interfering with the law is a crime, Miss Keller, and Sheriff Thompson will be mighty interested to hear how you've been stirring up trouble." The pain was blinding as her scalp burned from the relentless pulling. Ruby could feel loose strands of hair being torn from her head with each rough yank. Her blue calico dress was already torn at the shoulder, and dust covered the once pristine fabric. Somewhere in the struggle, she had lost one of her boots, and her stockinged foot was becoming raw against the rough ground. The crowd parted suddenly as a tall figure stepped directly into Holloway's path. His face was shadowed by the brim of a black Stetson, but his stance was unmistakable: legs planted firmly apart, shoulders squared, and right hand hovering near the Colt revolver strapped to his hip. "Touch her again, and it'll be the last thing you do with that hand, Holloway." The voice was deep and steady, with a quiet menace that silenced the murmuring crowd. Deputy Holloway froze, his grip on Ruby's hair loosening just enough for her to pull away and scramble backward, cradling her tender scalp. "Yates Blackburn." Holloway spat the name like it was poison. "This ain't your business, Cowboy. The woman's interfered with official law business." Yates took a step closer, and for the first time, Ruby could see his face clearly. Weathered from sun and wind, with piercing green eyes that held Holloway's gaze without wavering. A thin scar ran along his left cheekbone, and several days' worth of stubble darkened his jaw. He wasn't just any cowboy, he was the foreman of the Circle B ranch outside of town, known for his fair treatment of his men and uncompromising nature. "I saw what happened at Martinez's shop," Yates said evenly. "The only one breaking the law here is you, demanding money that's already been paid. Old man Martinez showed you the receipt." Ruby struggled to her feet, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. She had seen Yates Blackburn in town before, had even served him once or twice when he came into her shop to purchase gifts for his sister. But they had never exchanged more than polite pleasantries. "The woman attacked an officer of the law," Holloway insisted, his hand drifting toward his own pistol. "She tried to stop you from robbing an old man," Yates countered. "And now you're assaulting her in broad daylight. Let her go, or we'll take this matter to Judge Wilson right now." The mention of the judge, a notoriously fair-minded man who had no great love for Sheriff Thompson or his deputies, made Holloway hesitate. The crowd was growing, and there were too many witnesses. "This ain't over," Holloway growled, backing away. "Sheriff Thompson will hear about this." "I'm counting on it," Yates replied coldly. As Holloway retreated down the street, Yates turned to Ruby. His stern expression softened as he took in her disheveled appearance and the angry red marks on her scalp where hair had been pulled out. "Are you all right, Miss Keller?" he asked, removing his hat and holding it respectfully at his side. Ruby nodded, then winced at the pain the movement caused. "I will be, Mr. Blackburn. Thank you for your intervention. I fear I would have faced worse at the sheriff's office." "You would have," he agreed grimly. Sheriff Thompson and his men have been demanding protection money from businesses all over town. Most folks are too scared to stand against them. I couldn't just watch, Ruby said, her voice strengthening with conviction despite her trembling hands. Mr. Martinez is 70 years old. His wife is ill. They barely make enough to get by, and Holloway was demanding double what he took last month. Yates glanced around at the dispersing crowd. Many were avoiding eye contact, hurrying back to their business now that the excitement was over. "You're brave, but they won't forget this," he warned. "Let me walk you back to your shop. You need to tend to those injuries, and I suspect you'll want to change your dress." Ruby looked down at her torn, dusty clothing and felt a flush of embarrassment. Her carefully pinned hair was now falling around her shoulders in tangled waves, and she could feel dirt streaking her face where tears had carved paths through it. "I must look a fright," she murmured. "You look like someone who stood up for what's right," Yates corrected her, offering his arm. "That's never a fright in my book." Ruby hesitated before placing her hand on his offered arm. She was acutely aware of the stares from townsfolk as Yates escorted her back toward her shop. She could already hear the whispers starting. Proper young ladies didn't get dragged through the streets, didn't require rescue from handsome cowboys, and certainly didn't walk arm in arm with men to whom they hadn't been formally introduced. Her shop, Keller's Millinery and Fine Goods, stood between the apothecary and the dressmakers. The green-painted door was still unlocked, just as she had left it when she'd run out after hearing Mr. Martinez's protests. "Thank you again, Mr. Blackburn," Ruby said as they reached her door. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Yates replaced his hat, touching the brim in a respectful gesture. "I'm just glad I was passing by. You should lock this door tonight and perhaps consider having someone stay with you. Holloway's not the forgiving type." "I'll be fine," Ruby assured him, though uncertainty fluttered in her stomach. "I have a rifle and know how to use it." A ghost of a smile touched Yates's lips. "I don't doubt it, Miss Keller. Still, I'll ride by later this evening if you don't mind, just to make sure everything's quiet." Before Ruby could respond, a woman's voice called out from across the street. "Ruby Keller, are you all right?" Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, hurried over, her round face creased with concern. "I just heard what happened. That dreadful Holloway. Someone should report him to the territorial marshal." Yates stepped back, nodding to Ruby. "Evening, Mrs. Peterson. Miss Keller, I'll be on my way." As he walked toward his horse hitched outside the general store, Ruby couldn't help watching him go. There was something in his manner, a quiet strength and integrity, that made her feel safe for the first time since arriving in Galesburg. But she knew enough about the tensions between the ranchers and the town's law enforcement to understand that Yates Blackburn had just made himself a target by defending her. The thought troubled her deeply as she allowed Mrs. Peterson to usher her inside the shop, clucking with motherly concern over her injuries and torn dress. "That man has a reputation," Mrs. Peterson whispered, helping Ruby into the small back room where she kept a wash basin and mirror. "They say Yates Blackburn once shot 2 rustlers trying to steal Circle B cattle, and that he faced down the Sullivan gang single-handed when they tried to rob the bank in Springfield." "I'm sure those are just stories," Ruby said, wincing as she dabbed a damp cloth at the scratches on her scalp. Mrs. Peterson shook her head. "Not all of them. What I do know is that Sheriff Thompson has been trying to force Mr. Blackburn's employer, Mr. Barrett, to sell parts of his ranch for months now. There's talk of the railroad wanting to come through, and certain people stand to make a fortune if they control the right land." Ruby paused, cloth in hand. "You think this could make things worse between them?" "I think, my dear, that you should be very careful," Mrs. Peterson advised. "Sheriff Thompson doesn't like being challenged, And now both you and Mr. Blackburn have done exactly that. After Mrs. Peterson left, Ruby changed into a clean dress and attempted to restore order to her hair. Her scalp was tender, and several small patches were missing hair entirely, but she managed to style it in a way that concealed the worst damage. The bruises on her arms where Holloway had grabbed her before resorting to dragging her by the hair were already darkening to a deep purple. The shop bell jingled as she returned to the front room. Ruby tensed, relaxing only when she saw Mr. Martinez's daughter, Elena, standing nervously in the doorway. "Miss Keller," Elena said, her dark eyes wide with concern. "My father sent me to thank you and to make sure you are not badly hurt. He feels terrible about what happened. Please tell your father it wasn't his fault," Ruby assured her, gesturing for Elena to enter. "How is he?" Elena twisted her hands in her apron. "Shaken, afraid they will come back. My father has decided we should close the shop and move to my brother's farm near Springfield." Ruby's heart sank. The Martinez family had run their small grocery for 15 years. "I'm so sorry, Elena. This isn't right." "No, it is not," the younger woman agreed. "But my father is old and my mother's health cannot bear any more worry. We leave in 3 days, once we sell what stock we can." After Elena left, Ruby stood in the silent shop, anger and helplessness warring within her. The Martinez family wasn't the first to leave Galesburg because of Sheriff Thompson's increasingly oppressive tactics. Since his appointment 2 years ago, nearly a dozen businesses had closed or changed hands under suspicious circumstances. As dusk fell, Ruby closed and locked her shop, then climbed the narrow stairs to her living quarters above. The 2 small rooms, a bedroom and a sitting room with a tiny kitchen area, had been her home since inheriting the business from her uncle. She had come to Galesburg after losing her parents to influenza back in Ohio, hoping for a fresh start in a growing town. For the most part, she had found it, building a modest but respectable business and making friends among the townspeople. Now she wondered if she would be the next to be forced out. A soft knock at the street door downstairs startled her from her thoughts. Cautiously, she took her rifle from its place beside the bed and moved to the window that overlooked the street. In the gathering darkness, she could make out a familiar tall figure standing at her door. Yates Blackburn had returned as promised. Ruby hurried down the stairs, rifle in hand, and called through the door. "Who is it?" "Yates Blackburn, Miss Keller." "Just checking that all's quiet, as I said I would." Ruby unlocked the door, opening it just enough to see him. He changed clothes since the afternoon, now wearing a clean shirt under his worn leather vest. His hat was pushed back slightly, revealing more of his face in the light spilling from her shop. "Everything's fine, Mr. Blackburn, though I appreciate your concern," Ruby said. Suddenly conscious of her own informal appearance, she had removed her collar and cuffs for comfort, and her hair was now loosely braided for the night. Yates nodded, his gaze moving past her to take in the darkened shop. "I'm glad to hear it. I've spoken with some of my men. They'll be staying in town tonight, keeping an eye out, 2 at the hotel across the street and 1 at the saloon." Ruby's eyes widened. "You think that's necessary?" "I think it's prudent," Yates replied carefully. "Holloway and Thompson aren't known for letting things go, especially when their authority is questioned publicly." "You've put yourself in danger because of me," Ruby said quietly. "I'm sorry for that." Yates's expression softened slightly. "Don't be. Those men have been abusing their power for too long. Someone needed to stand up to them." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of piano music from the saloon down the street. Ruby realized she was still holding her rifle and self-consciously lowered it. "You do know how to use that," Yates observed with approval. "My father taught me. We lived in rural Ohio before I came here. He said a woman alone should know how to protect herself." Yates nodded. He was right. He glanced down the street, then back at Ruby. "I should let you get some rest. Lock up behind me and don't open for anyone you don't know, even if they claim to be the law." "I won't," Ruby promised. Then, acting on impulse, she added, "Would you like to come in for coffee before you go? It's the least I can offer after everything you've done." Surprise flickered across his face, followed by something warmer. "Another time, perhaps. I need to check in with my men, make sure they're set for the night." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good night, Miss Keller." "Good night, Mr. Blackburn," Ruby replied, watching as he walked back toward his horse. Only when he had mounted and ridden off did she close and lock the door, a strange mix of relief and disappointment settling in her chest. True to Yates's prediction, the night did not pass quietly. Around midnight, Ruby was awakened by the sound of breaking glass. Grabbing her rifle, she rushed to the window in time to see a rock lying amid shattered glass on her shop floor. Outside, 3 men on horseback galloped away, their laughter carrying on the night air. Before she could react further, 2 men emerged from the shadows across the street the ranch hands Yates had stationed at the hotel. They mounted quickly and gave chase, though Ruby doubted they would catch the vandals. By morning, word of the incident had spread through town. Ruby had swept up the glass and was attempting to board up the window when Alina Martinez appeared with her brother and father. Without a word, the men set to work properly repairing the window while Alina helped Ruby clean the shop. "You are not alone, Miss Keller," Mr. Martinez told her in his accented English. "Many in town are grateful for what you did yesterday, but afraid to show it too openly," Ruby said with understanding rather than bitterness. The old man nodded sadly. "Times are difficult. But remember, even in darkness, there are those who watch and wait for the right moment to stand with you." By mid-morning, the window was repaired, and the Martinez family had gone. Ruby had just reopened her shop when the door swung open and Sheriff Thompson himself entered. Unlike his deputy, Thompson was a well-dressed man who cultivated an air of respectability. His carefully waxed mustache and tailored suits gave him the appearance of a businessman rather than a frontier lawman. "Miss Keller," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I've come to personally apologize for yesterday's unfortunate incident with Deputy Holloway. He was overzealous in his duties, and I assure you he has been disciplined." Ruby kept the counter between them, her hands hidden beneath where she gripped a small derringer. "That's very kind of you, Sheriff, though it doesn't explain the rock through my window last night." Thompson's smile didn't reach his cold eyes. "A regrettable incident, likely just drunken cowboys. I'll look into it personally." "The same way you looked into the fire at Johnson's newspaper office last month?" Ruby asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "Or the break-in at Dr. Miller's after he treated that wounded Pawnee man?" The sheriff's facade of politeness slipped for just an instant, revealing the hard, calculating man beneath. "Careful, Miss Keller. A woman in business alone needs the goodwill of the community and its law enforcement." "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" "Simply an observation," Thompson replied smoothly. "I understand you're friendly with Yates Blackburn. I should warn you that he's not the upstanding citizen he pretends to be. There are certain investigations ongoing regarding cattle rustling at the Circle B." Ruby kept her expression neutral. "Mr. Blackburn merely intervened in a public assault as any decent man would." "Of course," Thompson agreed too readily. "Still, I wouldn't get too attached. Men like Blackburn tend to move on when things get complicated." He replaced his hat. "Good day, Miss Keller. Do let me know if there are any further disturbances at your establishment." After he left, Ruby sank onto the stool behind the counter, her hands shaking with both fear and anger. The sheriff's message had been clear: distance herself from Yates Blackburn or face consequences. The noon stage brought a welcome distraction, a shipment of new hat forms and ribbons that Ruby had ordered from Chicago. As she unpacked the crate, the shop bell jingled again. This time, it was Mrs. Barrett, wife of the Circle B ticket's owner and Yates Blackburn's employer. "Miss Keller," the elegant older woman greeted her warmly. "I hope I find you well after yesterday's unpleasantness. My husband and I were so distressed to hear of your mistreatment." "I'm quite recovered, Mrs. Barrett, thank you," Ruby assured her, quickly setting aside the packing materials. "How may I help you today?" "I need a new hat for my niece's wedding in Springfield next month," Mrs. Barrett explained, removing her gloves. "Something with blue ribbons to match her eyes." She paused, then added in a lower voice, "And I wanted to tell you that you have friends at the Circle B, my dear. What you did for old Mr. Martinez took courage." Ruby felt a rush of gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Barrett. That means more than I can say." As Ruby showed her various hat styles, Mrs. Barrett continued conversationally. "Yates told us what happened. He was quite impressed by your bravery. He's not a man easily impressed, you know." Ruby felt heat rise to her cheeks. Mr. Blackburn was the brave one. "I simply couldn't stand by and watch an injustice." Mrs. Barrett smiled knowingly. "Perhaps that's why you both acted as you did. You share certain qualities, a strong sense of right and wrong, and the courage to act on it." She selected a cream-colored bonnet with a wide brim. "This one, I think, with blue ribbons and perhaps some small silk flowers." As Ruby made notes on the customization, Mrs. Barrett added casually, "We're having a small gathering at the ranch this Saturday. Nothing formal, just dinner and perhaps some music. Mr. Barrett would be delighted if you would join us." Ruby looked up in surprise. The Barretts were among the wealthiest and most respected families in the county. Their gatherings, while not frequent, were known to include prominent merchants, bankers, and ranchers from throughout the region. "I would be honored, Mrs. Barrett, but are you certain? After yesterday, I fear I may not be the most welcome guest in certain circles." "Precisely why you must come," Mrs. Barrett said firmly. "Those certain circles need to understand that you have the support of others whose opinions matter in this county. Besides," she added with a twinkle in her eye, "I suspect Yates would appreciate seeing you in more pleasant circumstances." Ruby busied herself with measuring ribbon to hide her flustered reaction. "I'll look forward to it then." After Mrs. Barrett left, Ruby found herself both excited and apprehensive about the invitation. The prospect of seeing Yates again sent an unexpected thrill through her. But she was equally aware that accepting the Barrett's support meant openly aligning herself against Sheriff Thompson and his allies. That evening, as Ruby was preparing to close the shop, the bell jingled once more. She looked up to see Yates standing in the doorway, hat in hand. "Mr. Blackburn," she said, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "This is a surprise." "I heard about your window," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him, "and about Thompson's visit." "News travels fast," Ruby observed, "in small towns always." Yates moved closer, his expression serious. "What did he say to you?" Ruby hesitated, then decided honesty was the best approach. "He suggested I distance myself from you if I want to avoid further incidents. He mentioned something about investigations into cattle rustling at the Circle B." Anger flashed in Yates's green eyes. "There's no rustling. It's just another attempt to pressure Mr. Barrett into selling land along the proposed railroad route." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I'm sorry you've been dragged into this." "I dragged myself into it," Ruby reminded him, gathering her courage, And I don't regret it." She busied herself straightening a display of ribbons. "Mrs. Barrett invited me to dinner at the ranch on Saturday." Yates's expression lightened. "She mentioned she might. Will you come?" "I'd like to," Ruby admitted, "though I worry it might make things worse with the sheriff." "Things will get worse with Thompson regardless," Yates said grimly. "He's not used to being challenged, and now the Martinses are telling everyone who'll listen about what happened. Others are starting to speak up about similar incidents." "Is that a good thing?" "It could be," Yates said, "if enough people stand together." He moved to the window, looking out at the darkening street. "I've sent a letter to the territorial marshal in Springfield, detailing what we know about Thompson's activities. It may take time for any official action, though." Ruby joined him at the window. "In the meantime, we watch our backs." Yates turned to her, his expression softening. "I'll watch yours if you'll watch mine." The simple statement, delivered with quiet sincerity, sent a warmth through Ruby that had nothing to do with the spring evening. For a moment, they stood close enough that she could smell the leather of his vest and the faint scent of soap. "I should escort you home," Yates said, breaking the moment. Then, realizing his mistake, he added with a small smile, "Though I suppose you are home, aren't you?" "I forgot your quarters are above the shop." Ruby laughed. "They are, though I was about to close up and head upstairs. Would you like that coffee I offered yesterday?" This time, Yates accepted. Ruby locked the shop door and led him up the narrow stairs to her small sitting room. It was a modest space but neat and comfortable, with a small sofa, a rocking chair, and shelves lined with books, her one true indulgence. "You like to read," Yates observed as Ruby busied herself at the small stove. "My mother was a school teacher before she married," Ruby explained. "She believed education was important for everyone, especially girls." She gestured to the shelves. "Feel free to look." Yates approached the bookcase, examining the titles with interest. "Austen Dickens' Hawthorne, and I see Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass." "That caused quite a stir when it was published." "You've read it?" Ruby asked in surprise, bringing 2 steaming cups to the small table. Yates nodded, taking the offered cup. "My father was a professor before he came west. Our ranch house had more books than most libraries." A shadow crossed his face. "Most burned when Comanches raided our Texas homestead. I was 14. "Your parents?" Ruby asked softly. "Both killed. My sister and I survived by hiding in the root cellar." He sipped his coffee, clearly uncomfortable with the memories. "Mr. Barrett was a friend of my father's. He took us in, raised us like his own. I've worked for him ever since." "I'm sorry about your parents," Ruby said. "I lost mine to influenza 5 years ago. My uncle here in Galesburg was my only remaining family, and then he passed just 2 years later." "And yet you stayed," Yates observed. "Took over his business." Ruby nodded. "It was home by then, or the closest thing to it." They talked easily after that, discovering shared interests in literature and music. Yates revealed that he played the violin, a skill his professor father had insisted upon, while Ruby admitted to a passable talent at the piano. "Mrs. Barrett mentioned music at the gathering Saturday," Ruby recalled. "Perhaps you'll play." "Only if you'll accompany me," Yates countered with a smile that transformed his usually serious face. Before they knew it, 2 hours had passed. When Yates finally stood to leave, there was a reluctance in his movements that matched Ruby's own feelings. "Thank you for the coffee," he said, reaching for his hat. "And the conversation. It's been too long since I've had either with someone who appreciates Whitman." "You're welcome anytime," Ruby told him sincerely. "Though I should warn you, Sheriff Thompson would not approve of your literary tastes any more than your choice of friends." Yates's smile turned wry. "All the more reason to indulge in both." At the door, he hesitated. I'd like to escort you to the ranch on Saturday if you'll allow it. My sister Caroline will be there. I think you'd like each other." "I'd like that," Ruby agreed, surprised by how much she meant it. After Yates left, Ruby stood at her small window, watching his tall figure move down the darkened street toward the livery where he'd left his horse. For the first time since the incident with Holloway, the knot of anxiety in her chest had loosened, replaced by something warm and unfamiliar, something that felt dangerously like hope. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Word of Ruby's stand against Deputy Holloway had spread, and while some townsfolk avoided her shop, others made a point of stopping by with words of encouragement or small purchases. The Martinez family completed their preparations to leave, selling most of their stock to other merchants at reduced prices. On Friday afternoon, as Ruby was helping Alina pack the last of her personal belongings, Sheriff Thompson's deputy, not Holloway, but another man named Becker, entered the Martinez store. "Sheriff says you folks need to settle your tax bill before leaving town," Becker announced without preamble, slapping a paper on the counter. Alina's brother Miguel picked up the document, his face darkening with anger. "We paid our taxes in January. This says we owe for the full year. We're only in April. New county ordinance," Becker said with a shrug. "Businesses that close must pay the full year's assessment." "There is no such ordinance," Ruby interjected, unable to remain silent. "The town council would have had to approve it." Becker's gaze shifted to her, cold and threatening. "Seems you didn't learn your lesson the other day, Miss Keller. Maybe the sheriff should take a closer look at your tax situation, too." Before Ruby could respond, the store door opened again. This time, it was Judge Wilson, the county magistrate, who entered. In his 70s, with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes, the judge was respected throughout the county for his fairness and integrity. "I thought I might find you here, Deputy," the judge said mildly. "Mrs. Wilson mentioned seeing you ride this way with what looked suspiciously like fraudulent tax documents." Becker's confidence faltered. "Just delivering official notices, Judge. Sheriff's orders." "Indeed." Judge Wilson took the paper from Miguel's hand and examined it. "Curious. I don't recall signing this ordinance, and as the presiding judicial authority in this county, I would have had to do so." He folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. "I believe I'll keep this as evidence." "Evidence of what?" Becker demanded. "Attempted extortion for a start," the judge replied calmly. "Perhaps falsification of government documents. We shall see." He turned to the Martinez family. "You're free to leave when you wish, with no additional payments required. The county wishes you well in your new endeavors." After a tense moment, Becker backed down, leaving the store with a mumbled threat that no one quite caught. Judge Wilson waited until he was gone before turning to Ruby. "You've stirred up quite a hornet's nest, Miss Keller," he observed, though his tone held approval rather than censure. "Thompson and his men have operated unchecked for too long. It's about time someone had the courage to stand against them." "I'm not sure courage had much to do with it, Your Honor," Ruby admitted. "I simply couldn't watch Mr. Martinez being bullied." "That young lady is precisely what courage looks like." The judge tipped his hat. "I understand you'll be at the Barrett Ranch tomorrow evening. I look forward to continuing our conversation there." After he left, Alina hugged Ruby tightly. "You see, things are already changing. Judge Wilson has never interfered with the sheriff before." Ruby returned the embrace, though she wasn't as optimistic. "Be careful on your journey, all of you. I'll write once you're settled at your brother's farm." That evening, Ruby closed the shop early to prepare for the dinner at the Barrett Ranch. She had spent far too much time deliberating over what to wear, finally selecting her best dress, a deep blue silk with modest lace trim that she had made herself. It wasn't as fashionable as what the wealthier ladies of the county would wear, but it was clean, well-made, and becoming with her auburn hair and fair skin. As she was pinning her hair, a soft knock came at the shop door downstairs. Ruby checked the clock. It was barely past 6, and Yates wasn't due to collect her until 7. Cautiously, she descended the stairs and called through the door. "Who is it?" "Caroline Blackburn," came a female voice. "Yates's sister." "I hope I'm not intruding, but I thought I might introduce myself before the gathering tonight." Ruby unlocked the door to find a young woman, perhaps 2 or 3 years her junior, with the same striking green eyes as her brother, though her hair was a lighter brown, nearly blonde in places. She was dressed simply but elegantly in a riding habit, and her open, friendly expression immediately put Ruby at ease. "Please come in," Ruby invited. "I was just getting ready." "I can see that," Caroline said with a warm smile, following Ruby upstairs. "And I won't stay long. I just wanted to meet the woman who's had my brother talking about something besides cattle and horses for the first time in years." Ruby felt her cheeks warm. "I'm sure Mr. Blackburn has many interests beyond his work." Caroline laughed, a bright musical sound. "Oh, he does. Books and music and even politics when the mood strikes him. But people, especially female people, those he tends to keep at a distance." She perched on the arm of Ruby's small sofa. "Until you." "We've only just met," Ruby protested mildly, returning to her mirror to finish with her hair. "Sometimes that's all it takes," Caroline said with a knowing look, "especially when the meeting involves defending someone against injustice. Yates has always had a particular hatred for bullies. Because of what happened to your parents?" Ruby asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous." "No, you're right," Caroline said, her expression growing more serious. "The raid that killed our parents wasn't random. A man wanted our land, tried to force our father to sell. When that didn't work, he paid a group of renegades to attack our homestead." Her voice hardened. "Yates has never forgotten. He was old enough to understand exactly what happened and why." "Did they ever catch the man responsible?" Ruby asked. Caroline shook her head. "He was too powerful, too protected. By the time Yates was old enough to do anything about it, the man had died of natural causes." She stood, smoothing her skirt. "That's why what's happening here matters so much to him. He sees the same pattern with Sheriff Thompson and his associates." Ruby set down her hairbrush, turning to face Caroline. "I never intended to become involved in any of this. I just couldn't stand by and watch." "Neither could Yates," Caroline pointed out gently. "It's what drew him to you, I think." She moved toward the stairs. "I should let you finish preparing. I just wanted to say that I'm glad we'll have a chance to become acquainted tonight and that." She hesitated. "My brother deserves someone who understands what drives him." After Caroline left, Ruby sat for a long moment, considering her words. She had felt an immediate connection to Yates, beyond mere gratitude for his intervention. There was something in his quiet strength and unwavering principles that resonated with her own beliefs. But was it merely shared values, or something more? The question lingered in her mind as she finished dressing. At precisely 7 o'clock, another knock came at the door. This time it was Yates, looking more formally dressed than Ruby had seen him before, in a crisp white shirt, dark waistcoat, and clean black trousers. His hair was neatly trimmed and he had shaved, revealing the strong line of his jaw and making the scar on his cheekbone more noticeable. "Miss Keller," he greeted her, his eyes warming as they took in her appearance. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," Ruby replied, suddenly shy under his appreciative gaze. "And please, after all that's happened, I think you might call me Ruby." A smile touched his lips. "Ruby, then, and I'm Yates to my friends." The ride to the Barrett Ranch took nearly an hour, following the winding road that led westward out of Galesburg. Yates had brought a light buggy rather than his usual horse, making the journey more comfortable. As they traveled, he pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the area. "The Circle B stretches from that ridge all the way to the river," he explained, indicating the vast expanse of grassland dotted with grazing cattle. "Mr. Barrett started with just 100 acres 20 years ago. Now, it's one of the largest spreads in the county." "It's beautiful country," Ruby observed, admiring the rolling landscape bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. "It is," Yates agreed. "Worth protecting." He glanced at her. "Caroline mentioned she visited you earlier. I hope she didn't overwhelm you. She can be direct." Ruby laughed. "I liked her immediately. She clearly cares for you a great deal." "We've always looked after each other," Yates said simply. "After our parents died, we didn't have anyone else until the Barretts took us in." As they approached the ranch house, a large, well-built two-story structure of timber and stone, Ruby could see lanterns illuminating the wide porch and hear the sounds of conversation and laughter drifting from within. Several buggies and horses were already hitched at the rail outside. "Nervous?" Yates asked, noting her sudden silence. "A little," Ruby admitted. "I don't often attend such gatherings." "You'll be the most interesting person there," he assured her, bringing the buggy to a stop. "And the bravest." Before Ruby could respond, Mrs. Barrett appeared on the porch, waving in welcome. "Yates, Miss Keller, we were beginning to wonder if you'd been delayed." The evening progressed more pleasantly than Ruby could have imagined. The Barrett home was comfortable and tastefully furnished, with none of the ostentatious displays of wealth that some prosperous families favored. The guests, about 20 in all, included Judge Wilson and his wife, several prominent ranchers and merchants, and even Dr. Miller, who had faced his own troubles with the sheriff after treating the Pawnee man. After dinner, the party moved to the spacious parlor, where Mrs. Barrett encouraged Ruby to play the piano. Though initially hesitant, Ruby acquiesced, performing a simple but lovely rendition of "Beautiful Dreamer." When she finished, Yates retrieved his violin from its case and joined her for several more pieces, their musical partnership drawing appreciative comments from the assembled guests. "You two play wonderfully together," Mrs. Barrett remarked when they finally surrendered the instruments to other guests. "As though you've been practicing for years." Ruby caught Yates's eye and smiled. There had been something almost magical in the way their music had blended, each anticipating the other's tempo and expression, without a word being spoken. It had felt like a conversation of sorts, intimate despite the audience. Later, as the evening was winding down, Judge Wilson drew Ruby and Yates aside, his expression serious despite the festive atmosphere. "I wanted you both to know that I've been in contact with the territorial marshal," he said quietly. "He's been building a case against Thompson and several of his deputies for some time, but lacks sufficient evidence or witnesses willing to testify." "Until now?" Yates asked. The judge nodded. "The Martinez incident, combined with several others that people have finally come forward about, may be enough. The marshal plans to visit Galesburg within the next 2 weeks. Thompson won't go quietly," Yates warned, "and if he gets wind of the investigation beforehand." "Which is why discretion is paramount," the judge agreed. "In the meantime, Miss Keller, I would advise caution in your daily activities. Perhaps staying with friends outside of town would be prudent." Ruby shook her head firmly. "I won't be driven from my home or business, Your Honor." "That would only show Thompson that his tactics work." Judge Wilson sighed but nodded in understanding. "Then please accept additional protection. I believe Mr. Blackburn has already arranged for some of his men to keep watch. Yates confirmed this with a nod. "Day and night, though discreetly. We don't want to provoke a direct confrontation if it can be avoided." As the evening came to a close, Yates helped Ruby into the buggy for the return journey. The night had turned cool, and he wrapped a blanket around her shoulders before taking the reins. "Did you enjoy yourself?" he asked as they set off down the moonlit road. "Very much," Ruby said sincerely. "Your family, the Barretts, they're good people." "The best I've known," Yates agreed. "Mr. Barrett taught me everything about ranching, but more importantly, he showed me what it means to be a man of principle." He glanced at Ruby. "Like standing up for what's right even when it's difficult or dangerous," Ruby added softly. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in thought. Finally, Ruby spoke again. "Caroline told me about the man who was responsible for your parents' deaths. How he was never brought to justice." Yates's hands tightened on the reins. "She shouldn't have burdened you with that old history." "It wasn't a burden," Ruby assured him. "It helped me understand why this situation with the sheriff matters so much to you." She hesitated. "Is that why you intervened when you saw Holloway dragging me?" Yates was quiet for so long that Ruby thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and intense. "I would have stepped in regardless of who was being mistreated," he said. "But seeing it was you, something in me couldn't bear it. I'd noticed you before, in town, at church sometimes." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "You always seemed so, composed, self-sufficient, but kind too, especially to the children and older folks." Ruby felt her heart quicken at his words. "I never realized you'd noticed me." "How could I not?" Yates asked simply. "You stand out, Ruby, not just because of your beauty, though there's that too. It's your spirit, the way you carry yourself with dignity regardless of circumstances." The admission, spoken so straightforwardly, left Ruby momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a response, Yates suddenly pulled the buggy to a halt, his body tensing as he peered ahead into the darkness. "What is it?" Ruby whispered, sensing his alarm. "Riders," Yates said quietly, reaching beneath the seat and producing a revolver. "Just ahead, where the road narrows through that stand of cottonwoods." Ruby strained her eyes and could just make out the silhouettes of mounted men positioned on either side of the road. "An ambush." "Looks that way." Yates handed her the reins. "If there's trouble, take the buggy and go, head straight back to the ranch. Don't stop for anything." "I'm not leaving you," Ruby protested. "This isn't up for debate." Yates's tone was firm as he checked his pistol. "I promise to keep you safe, and I mean to." Before Ruby could argue further, a harsh voice called out from the darkness. "That's far enough, Blackburn. Step down from the buggy, nice and slow." Ruby recognized the voice immediately. Deputy Holloway. Yates remained seated, though his body was tense with readiness. "Evening, Holloway. Bit late for a social call, isn't it?" "This isn't social," came the reply as Holloway moved his horse forward into a patch of moonlight. Behind him, Ruby could now see 3 other mounted men. "Sheriff Thompson wants a word with you about interfering with official law business." "He knows where to find me in daylight," Yates replied evenly. "Now step aside and let us pass." Holloway's laugh was ugly. "You're not in a position to be giving orders, Cowboy. Not when you're outnumbered 4-1. 3-1, came a new voice from behind them. "You never were good at counting, Holloway." Ruby twisted in her seat to see Yates's foreman, a weathered man named Harlan, emerging from the shadows with a rifle trained on the deputies. Yates didn't take his eyes off Holloway. "Last chance. Step aside." For a tense moment, it seemed Holloway might press the confrontation. Then, with a curse, he jerked his horse out of the road. "This isn't over, Blackburn. Not by a long shot. And you, Miss Keller, the sheriff hasn't forgotten your part in this mess." Tell Thompson, if he has a problem with me, he can take it up with the territorial marshal, Yates replied coldly. I'm sure they'll have plenty to discuss when the marshal arrives next week. Holloway's head snapped up. What marshal? Yates didn't answer, simply taking the reins back from Ruby and urging the horses forward. They passed through the gauntlet of deputies without further incident, Harlan following behind until they were well clear of the ambush point. Thank you, Harlan, Yates said when the foreman rode up alongside them. Good timing. Been shadowing you since you left the ranch, Harlan explained. Mr. Barrett's orders. He figured Thompson might try something like this. After ensuring they were safely on their way, Harlan rode ahead to alert the ranch hands stationed in town of the incident. Yates and Ruby continued at a faster pace, both acutely aware that the confrontation had escalated the tension between them and the sheriff. You shouldn't have told them about the marshal, Ruby said worriedly. Judge Wilson said discretion was important. I know, Yates acknowledged, but I needed something to make them back down. And now that they know an investigation is coming, Thompson might make mistakes, get sloppy in covering his tracks. Or he might become more dangerous, Ruby pointed out. Desperate men often are. Yates reached over to squeeze her hand briefly. That's why we'll be extra careful until the marshal arrives. When they reached Galesburg, the streets were mostly deserted, with only the saloon showing signs of activity. Yates drove directly to Ruby's shop, where two of his ranch hands were already positioned, one across the street and another near the alley that ran behind the buildings. I don't like leaving you, Yates admitted as he helped Ruby down from the buggy. Not after what happened tonight. I'll be fine, Ruby assured him, though she too felt uneasy. Your men are watching and I have my rifle. Yates walked her to the door, waiting as she unlocked it. In the dim light from the street lamp, his expression was troubled. Ruby, Whatever he meant to say was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Both turned to see Sheriff Thompson himself riding toward them, flanked by Deputy Becker. Yates moved protectively in front of Ruby. Well, isn't this cozy? Thompson remarked, reining in his horse. The shopkeeper and the cowboy, returning from a night of socializing with the county's elite. Is there a law against that, Sheriff? Ruby asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Thompson ignored her, addressing Yates instead. I understand you had a disagreement with some of my deputies on the road tonight. Your deputies were attempting to ambush us, Yates corrected him. That's a crime, even for men with badges. An unfortunate misunderstanding, Thompson said dismissively. They were merely attempting to deliver an official message. His cold gaze shifted to Ruby. Miss Keller, in light of recent disturbances, the town council has authorized increased patrols around businesses. You'll be seeing more of my deputies in this area. How thoughtful, Ruby replied, the sarcasm barely concealed. Though I can't help but notice that the town council hasn't held a meeting in 3 weeks. A flash of anger crossed Thompson's face before he mastered it. You should be careful about the company you keep, Miss Keller. Mr. Blackburn here has a troubled history with the law. The only trouble I see is wearing a badge right now, Yates said evenly. Good night, Sheriff. I suggest you and your deputy move along before Judge Wilson hears about another attempt at intimidation. At the mention of the judge, Thompson's expression hardened, but he made no further comment, merely touching the brim of his hat in mock courtesy before riding away with Becker following. He's planning something, Yates said grimly once they were alone again. That wasn't just intimidation, he was assessing the situation, seeing how closely you're being guarded. Ruby shivered, and not just from the night air. What do? We stay vigilant, Yates said. And maybe we speed things up with the marshal. He hesitated, then added, I'd feel better if you weren't alone tonight. Ruby's eyes widened at the implication, but Yates quickly clarified. I meant perhaps Caroline could stay with you, or you could stay at the hotel where my men are watching. Oh, Ruby said, feeling both relieved and oddly disappointed. I'll be all right. The shop can be secured, and as you said, your men are watching. Yates studied her face in the dim light, then nodded reluctantly. At least let me check the premises before I leave. Together, they entered the shop and climbed the stairs to Ruby's living quarters. Yates moved through the small rooms methodically, checking windows and potential entry points. Finding everything in order, he returned to where Ruby waited by the door. Lock this behind me, he instructed. And don't open it for anyone but me or one of my men, and only if they give the proper signal. He demonstrated a particular pattern of knocks. I'll return at first light to escort you to breakfast. As he turned to leave, Ruby impulsively caught his arm. Thank you, Yates, for everything. He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then met her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, it seemed he might say more, might even close the small distance between them. Instead, he gently covered her hand with his own. Get some rest, Ruby. Tomorrow may be a difficult day. After he left, Ruby secured the door as instructed and prepared for bed, though she doubted sleep would come easily. Her mind kept returning to the events of the evening, the wonderful hours at the Barrett Ranch, the terrifying confrontation on the road, and the lingering threat of Thompson's veiled warnings. But more than anything, she found herself dwelling on Yates, his quiet strength, his evident concern for her safety, and the unspoken connection that seemed to be growing between them. Despite the danger surrounding them, or perhaps because of it, Ruby recognized that her feelings for him had developed into something far deeper than gratitude or friendship. Whether he felt the same remained uncertain, though Caroline's words and his own actions suggested he might. The thought both thrilled and frightened her, for any future between them would surely be complicated by the brewing conflict with Sheriff Thompson and his men. As she finally drifted toward sleep, Ruby's last conscious thought was of Yates's face in the moonlight and the promise of his return with the morning sun. The next day dawned clear and surprisingly peaceful. True to his word, Yates appeared at Ruby's door just as the first rays of sunlight were touching the town. They breakfasted at the hotel dining room, joined by Caroline, who had ridden in from the ranch with fresh news. Judge Wilson sent a telegram to the territorial marshal last night, she informed them quietly over coffee. He's arriving tomorrow, not next week as originally planned. That's good news, Ruby said with relief. The sooner this is resolved, the better. Yates looked less certain. It might force Thompson's hand if he finds out. We need to be especially careful today and tonight. Despite the tension, the day passed without incident. Ruby opened her shop as usual, and to her surprise, business was brisk. It seemed many in town were making a point of showing support, however quietly. Even Mr. Peterson, the baker, whose wife had been so concerned for Ruby after the incident with Holloway, stopped by to order a new hat for his daughter's birthday. Folks are talking, he told her in a low voice as she wrapped his purchase. About Sheriff Thompson and his deputies, about how they've been treating people, not just you and the Martinez family, but others too, things that people were too afraid to mention before. Is that good or bad for me? Ruby asked wryly. Mr. Peterson's expression was somber. Depends on how many speak up when the time comes and how many stay silent out of fear. He patted her hand. You're a brave young woman, Miss Keller. This town needs more like you. Throughout the day, Ruby was aware of Yates's men maintaining their watch, though they were discreet enough that most townspeople wouldn't notice anything unusual. Yates himself came and went, checking on her between his duties at the ranch and errands in town. During one such visit in the afternoon, he brought unexpected news. Thompson and his deputies left town about an hour ago, he reported. All of them headed east toward Springfield. Ruby looked up from the hat she was trimming. That seems suspicious. Very, Yates agreed, his expression troubled. Harlan's following them at a distance. I've sent word to Judge Wilson as well. Could they have learned about the marshal's early arrival? Ruby wondered. Possibly, though I don't see how. The judge only sent the telegram last night, and he used a private code. Yates moved to the window, scanning the street with practiced eyes. In any case, I don't like it. Thompson isn't the type to run, which means he's planning something. As dusk fell, Yates returned to escort Ruby to dinner at the hotel. The town seemed unusually quiet, with fewer people than normal on the streets, despite the pleasant spring evening. Everyone's waiting, Yates observed as they walked. They can feel that something's coming, even if they don't know what. At the hotel dining room, they were joined by Caroline and Judge Wilson, who had additional news. I received a return telegram from the marshal, the judge informed them, keeping his voice low despite the nearly empty room. He's bringing several deputies and will arrive on the morning train. He also advised that he's received troubling reports about Thompson from other communities where he served previously. What kind of reports? Ruby asked. The judge's expression was grim. Similar patterns of corruption and intimidation. In the last town, before coming here, a newspaper editor who spoke out against him was found dead, supposedly a suicide, though many had their doubts. The implications hung heavily in the air. After dinner, as they were preparing to leave, a breathless ranch hand burst into the hotel lobby. "Mr. Blackburn, fire at the livery stable. They're saying it's spreading fast." The entire group rushed outside to see orange flames illuminating the night sky at the eastern end of town. The livery stable, a wooden structure housing horses and carriages for travelers and townspeople without their own facilities, was fully engulfed. "Caroline, stay with Ruby," Yates instructed as he prepared to join the bucket brigade already forming. "Don't let her out of your sight." "Be careful," Ruby called after him, a sense of foreboding filling her as she watched him run toward the conflagration. Judge Wilson shook his head gravely. "This is no accident, not with Thompson and his men conveniently out of town." He patted Ruby's shoulder reassuringly. "Stay here with Miss Blackburn. I'll find out what I can." For the next hour, Ruby and Caroline watched anxiously from the hotel porch as the town battled the blaze. The livery stable was lost, but through heroic efforts, the surrounding buildings were saved. As the flames finally died down to smoldering embers, Yates returned, his face and clothing blackened with soot, but otherwise unharmed. "All the horses got out," he reported, accepting a glass of water from Caroline. "No human casualties, thank God, but it's definitely arson." Several witnesses saw someone matching Deputy Holloway's description near the stable shortly before the fire started. "But you said Thompson and his deputies left town," Ruby reminded him. "They did," Yates confirmed grimly. "Which means either Holloway doubled back, or they have accomplices we don't know about." Judge Wilson joined them, looking equally exhausted. The fire marshal found evidence of coal oil deliberately spread throughout the stable. This was meant as a distraction. A distraction from what? Caroline asked, but even as the words left her mouth, realization dawned on all their faces. "Your shop," Yates said, already moving toward the door. They wanted to draw everyone away from that end of town. The four of them rushed down the street toward Ruby's millinery. Yates and the judge leading the way with Ruby and Caroline following closely behind. As they approached, Ruby could see that her fears were justified. The door to her shop stood ajar, light spilling out onto the darkened street. Yates drew his revolver, signaling for the women to stay back as he and the judge cautiously approached. From inside the shop came the sounds of destruction, glass breaking, furniture being overturned. "Sheriff's office, come out with your hands up," Yates called, using the authority of law despite having no official standing. The sounds inside ceased abruptly, followed by the crash of a rear window breaking. Yates rushed into the shop while the judge circled around to the back alley. Inside, Ruby's beautiful shop had been systematically destroyed, display cases smashed, hats and ribbons strewn about and trampled, and worst of all, painted across one wall in what looked horribly like blood were the words, "Next time it's you." Ruby gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in horror. Caroline wrapped a supportive arm around her shoulders as they surveyed the devastation. "They're gone," Yates reported, returning from checking the back rooms. "Through the window. Judge Wilson is trying to follow, but they had horses waiting." Ruby moved numbly through the wreckage, picking up a torn ribbon here, a crushed hat formed there. "Everything's ruined," she whispered. "All my work, all my stock. Things can be replaced," Yates reminded her gently. "You can't," Judge Wilson returned, shaking his head in frustration. "Lost them in the darkness, but I'm certain it was Holloway and at least one other man." He surveyed the destruction with obvious anger. "This ends tomorrow when the marshal arrives. In the meantime, Miss Keller, you cannot stay here tonight." "She'll come to the ranch with us," Caroline said firmly. "It's the safest place." Ruby looked around once more at her violated shop and home. The message on the wall made the threat unmistakable. This had been a warning. Next time, they would come for her directly. "I'll need to gather some things," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll help you," Caroline offered, following Ruby upstairs. The living quarters had been searched but not vandalized to the same extent as the shop. Ruby quickly packed a carpetbag with essential clothing and personal items, including the small portrait of her parents that was her most treasured possession. When they returned downstairs, Yates was organizing several townsmen who had arrived after completing their firefighting efforts. They had already begun boarding up the broken window and door. "Mr. Peterson and Dr. Miller have offered to keep watch on the shop overnight," Yates informed Ruby. "And Mrs. Peterson is organizing a group to help with the cleanup tomorrow." Ruby was touched by their support, though it did little to ease the violation she felt. "Thank you all," she said simply, unable to find more adequate words. The ride to the Circle B ranch was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Ruby sat between Yates and Caroline in the buggy, drawing comfort from their presence. By the time they reached the ranch house, it was well past midnight, but Mrs. Barrett was waiting up for them. "My dear girl," she exclaimed, embracing Ruby warmly. "What a terrible ordeal! You must be exhausted." Ruby found herself fighting tears at the motherly concern. "I'm all right, Mrs. Barrett, just shaken." "Of course you are," Mrs. Barrett soothed. "Caroline, take Miss Keller to the blue bedroom. I've had fresh linens put on and water brought up for washing." She turned to Yates. "Mr. Barrett is in his study. He'd like to speak with you and the judge." As Caroline led Ruby upstairs, the younger woman explained, "The blue bedroom is next to mine. It's where we put honored guests." "I don't want to be a burden," Ruby protested weakly. Caroline squeezed her hand. "You're not a burden. You're family now." At Ruby's startled look, she added with a small smile, "Anyone who matters this much to my brother is family to me." The blue bedroom was lovely, spacious, and comfortable, with a large four-poster bed, a washstand with porcelain basin, and a small sitting area near the window. After Caroline left her to rest, Ruby washed the dust and smoke from her face and changed into a nightgown. Though exhausted, sleep eluded her as her mind replayed the events of the day. A soft knock at the door roused her from her troubled thoughts. "Ruby," "It's Yates. May I speak with you for a moment?" Ruby wrapped a shawl around her shoulders before opening the door. Yates had also washed and changed, though he still looked weary with shadows beneath his eyes. "I wanted to check that you had everything you needed," he said, remaining respectfully in the hallway. "Yes, thank you," Ruby assured him. "Your family has been very kind." Yates smiled slightly. "They like you. Especially Caroline. I think she's always wanted a sister." His expression grew more serious. "Ruby, about your shop." "It's just things," Ruby said, echoing his earlier words. "I can rebuild, start over." "You won't have to start over alone," Yates said firmly. "The whole town will help, and the Circle B will provide whatever support you need." He hesitated, then added more softly, "And I'll be there every step of the way if you'll allow it." The promise in his words went beyond the immediate crisis, and Ruby felt a warmth spread through her despite the day's trauma. "I'd like that very much," she replied, meeting his gaze directly. For a moment they stood in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then Yates cleared his throat. "The marshal will arrive on the 9 o'clock train tomorrow. Judge Wilson and I will meet him, along with Mr. Barrett and several other prominent citizens. With any luck, by this time tomorrow, Thompson and his deputies will be in custody." "And if not?" Ruby asked, voicing the fear that had been growing since seeing her destroyed shop. Yates's expression hardened. "Then we'll deal with them by other means if necessary. You'll be safe here at the ranch until everything is resolved one way or another." "I won't hide forever, Yates," Ruby said with quiet determination. "This is my home, my community. I won't be driven away by fear." "I wouldn't expect you to," Yates replied, and there was pride in his voice. "It's one of the things I admire most about you." He stepped back from the doorway. "Try to get some rest. Tomorrow will be a significant day, one way or another." "Good night, Yates," Ruby said softly. "Good night, Ruby," he returned, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment before he turned and walked down the hallway. Ruby closed the door and leaned against it, her heart beating rapidly. Despite the destruction of her shop and the lingering threat of Thompson's retribution, she found herself focusing on Yates's words, particularly his admission of admiration and his promise to stand with her. In the midst of chaos and danger, something precious was taking root between them, something that gave her hope for the future regardless of what the next day might bring. Morning came too quickly, rousing Ruby from the fitful sleep she had finally achieved. Caroline brought her a simple but lovely day dress to borrow, as Ruby's own clothing was limited to what she had hastily packed. "It might be a little long," Caroline apologized as Ruby tried it on, "but the color suits you beautifully." Breakfast was a subdued affair, with Mr. Barrett, Yates, and Judge Wilson discussing their plans for the marshal's arrival, while Mrs. Barrett and Caroline attempted to keep the conversation at least partially focused on more pleasant topics. "Will you be going into town with the men?" Ruby asked Caroline as they helped clear the breakfast dishes. "No, Mother and I will stay here with you," Caroline replied. "The men think it's safer, given yesterday's events." Ruby frowned. "I should be there. The threats were directed at me, and I witnessed Holloway's assault on Mr. Martinez." "You'll have your chance to testify," Mrs. Barrett assured her, overhearing the conversation. "But for today, it's best to let the marshal establish his authority first. Sheriff Thompson is less likely to attempt anything rash with federal officers present." Though not entirely satisfied, Ruby acquiesced to their reasoning. After the men departed for town, she tried to occupy herself with helping Mrs. Barrett and Caroline with household tasks, but her mind kept returning to Galesburg and what might be unfolding there. Mid-morning, as they were preparing to bake bread, a ranch hand arrived with news from town. "The marshal's train arrived on time," he reported. He and his deputies met with Mr. Barrett and the others at the judge's office. They've issued warrants for Sheriff Thompson and all his men. Have they found them? Mrs. Barrett asked anxiously. The ranch hand shook his head. Not yet, madam. The sheriff's office was empty when they went to serve the warrants. Looks like Thompson and his men cleared out their personal belongings sometime yesterday. So they knew the marshal was coming, Ruby concluded. That explains why they risked the attack on my shop. They were planning to leave town anyway. The marshals organized search parties, the ranch hand continued. Mr. Blackburn asked me to tell you they're checking all the likely hiding places within 20 miles. They think Thompson and his men might be holed up at an abandoned mining camp north of town. As the morning stretched into afternoon with no further news, Ruby's anxiety grew. The thought of Yates and the others potentially confronting Thompson and his deputies' armed men with nothing left to lose filled her with dread. Finally, unable to bear the waiting any longer, Ruby approached Mrs. Barrett. I know you believe it's safer for me to remain here, but I cannot simply wait while others risk themselves on my behalf. Please, let me return to town. Mrs. Barrett studied her for a long moment, then nodded. I understand. I felt the same way years ago when Mr. Barrett was involved in a similar situation with cattle rustlers. She turned to her daughter. Caroline, please have the light buggy prepared. You and I will accompany Miss Keller to town. Despite Caroline's protests about their safety, Mrs. Barrett was firm. 3 women traveling together in broad daylight will draw less attention than a woman with armed escorts. Besides, the danger is likely north of town where the search parties are concentrated. Within the hour, they were on the road to Galesburg. As they approached town, Ruby was relieved to see normal activity on the street, stores open, people going about their business, children playing. Whatever was happening with the search for Thompson, it had not disrupted daily life in town. They stopped first at Ruby's shop, where, true to Mr. Peterson's word, a group of women were already hard at work cleaning up the destruction. The offensive message had been scrubbed from the wall, broken glass swept away, and salvageable merchandise carefully sorted and cleaned. Mrs. Peterson organized all of us, explained Mrs. Miller, the doctor's wife, as she greeted Ruby. We couldn't stand to see your beautiful shop in such a state. Between us, we'll have it restored in no time. Ruby was overwhelmed by their kindness. I don't know how to thank you all. No thanks needed, Mrs. Peterson assured her, emerging from the back room with a broom. You stood up for the Martinez family when no one else would. Now we're standing up for you. She lowered her voice. Besides, we're all hoping this means the end of Sheriff Thompson's reign of terror. The marshal has already appointed Mr. Harlan as temporary sheriff until a proper election can be held. Yates's foreman? Ruby asked in surprise. Mrs. Peterson nodded. He was a deputy in Kansas before coming to work for the Circle B, a good man from all accounts. This news was encouraging, but Ruby was more concerned about the search for Thompson and his men and particularly about Yates's safety. After thanking the women again for their help, she, Mrs. Barrett, and Caroline continued to the judge's house, where they hoped to find more information. Mrs. Wilson welcomed them warmly, though she had little news to share. The judge and the others left with the marshal hours ago, she explained, serving them tea in her parlor. The last message we received indicated they were following fresh tracks toward the old Sullivan mine. How many men went with them? Mrs. Barrett asked. The marshal brought 3 deputies, and there are perhaps a dozen local men, including Mr. Barrett, Yates, and several of your ranch hands, Mrs. Wilson replied. The marshal seemed confident they could handle the situation. Ruby sipped her tea, trying to calm her nerves. And Sheriff Thompson has how many deputies? 4 officially, Mrs. Wilson said. "Though there are rumors he's recruited additional help from some unsavory characters who have passed through town recently." The implication was clear. The lawmen might be outnumbered. Ruby set down her cup, her decision made. "Mrs. Wilson, do you know where the Sullivan mine is located?" The older woman looked startled by the question. "About 8 miles north, near the ridge line." "But surely you're not thinking of going there?" "Not alone," Ruby clarified, turning to Mrs. Barrett and Caroline. "But if we took the buggy to the ridge overlook, we might be able to see what's happening. If Thompson and his men have indeed set a trap, perhaps we could warn the marshal and the others." Mrs. Barrett exchanged a look with her daughter. "It would be safer than blundering directly into a potential confrontation," she acknowledged. "And I know the spot you mean. Mr. Barrett and I picnicked there years ago. You can see the entire valley where the mine entrance is located." Despite Mrs. Wilson's concerns, the three women soon set off again, this time heading north out of town. Ruby had changed into one of her own dresses recovered from her shop and borrowed a pair of field glasses from Mrs. Wilson. They traveled in tense silence, each aware of the risks but equally determined to help if possible. The road to the ridge was rough, forcing them to proceed slowly. As they climbed higher, Ruby could see the valley spreading out below them, with the abandoned buildings of the Sullivan mine camp clearly visible in the afternoon sun. Smoke rose from one of the structures, indicating recent occupation. When they reached the overlook, Mrs. Barrett halted the buggy in a small clearing sheltered by pine trees. From this vantage point, they had an excellent view while remaining hidden from those below. Ruby raised the field glasses, focusing on the mine camp. What she saw made her blood run cold. Near the main building, once the mine office, several horses were tethered. Men with rifles were positioned on the surrounding hillsides, hidden among rocks and scrub brush. It was, as they had feared, an ambush. "They're waiting for the marshal and the search party," Ruby said, passing the glasses to Mrs. Barrett. "There must be at least 8 or 9 men down there." Mrs. Barrett confirmed her count after studying the scene, and more on the hillsides. "They've chosen their position well. Anyone approaching the camp would be exposed during the final quarter mile." "We have to warn them," Caroline said urgently. "The marshal's party could be massacred if they ride in unaware." Ruby had been thinking rapidly. "The approach from town would be along that trail," she said, pointing to a path that wound through the valley floor. "But if we continue along this ridge and then descend on the far side, we might intercept them before they reach the ambush point." Mrs. Barrett nodded approvingly. "Exactly what I was thinking. Caroline, take the reins. I'll keep watch with the field glasses while we travel." They set off immediately, following a narrow track that ran along the ridge. The going was treacherous in places, with the buggy wheels coming dangerously close to the edge of steep drop-offs. Caroline handled the horses expertly, however, keeping them moving at the fastest safe pace. After what seemed an eternity, but was probably no more than 20 minutes, Mrs. Barrett spotted the search party through the field glasses. "There they are," she reported, "just entering the valley from the south, about 2 miles from the mine camp." "We'll never reach them in time on this track," Caroline said worriedly, eyeing the rough terrain ahead. "It winds too much." Ruby made a quick decision. "Then we'll have to signal them somehow." She looked around desperately, then pointed to a dead pine tree standing starkly against the skyline. "If we could start a small fire at the base of that tree, the smoke might attract their attention. And if they see 3 women on the ridge, they'll know something's wrong," Mrs. Barrett agreed. "It's worth trying." They halted the buggy, and Ruby quickly gathered dry branches and pine needles while Caroline and Mrs. Barrett used flint and steel from their emergency kit to strike sparks. Soon, A small fire was burning at the base of the dead tree. The dry wood caught quickly, sending up a column of white smoke visible for miles. "Now we need to make ourselves seen," Ruby said, taking off her shawl and waving it vigorously. For several minutes, there was no indication that the search party had noticed either the smoke or their signals. Then, suddenly, the distant figures halted. Ruby could see through the field glasses that they were looking in their direction. "They've seen us," she reported excitedly. "Some of them are pointing up here." Through the glasses, she could now make out individual riders. Yates and Mr. Barrett were near the front, alongside a man who must be the marshal, identifiable by his distinctive hat and badge that caught the sunlight. As Ruby watched, Yates and two others separated from the main group and began riding toward the ridge toward them. "Yates is coming this way with two others," Ruby told her companions. "The rest are holding position." "Good," Mrs. Barrett said with satisfaction. "They're being cautious." "Now we need to meet Yates and explain the situation." They doused the small fire to prevent it spreading, then returned to the buggy. Caroline guided it carefully down a steep path that descended from the ridge toward the valley floor. They had covered perhaps half the distance when they met Yates and his companions, one of the marshal's deputies, and Harlan, the ranch foreman now serving as temporary sheriff. Yates's expression was a mixture of relief, concern, and exasperation as he recognized them. "What in God's name are you three doing out here?" he demanded, then immediately softened his tone. "Are you all right?" "We're fine," Ruby assured him. "But you and the others were riding into a trap. Sheriff Thompson and at least a dozen men are waiting at the mine camp. They have men positioned on the hillsides with rifles. You would have been caught in a crossfire with no cover." The marshal's deputy cursed under his breath. "Just as we suspected. Good thing you ladies spotted them." Harlan nodded grimly. "How many did you count exactly?" "At least 15, Mrs. Barrett reported. "Possibly more hidden inside the buildings." Yates's gaze hadn't left Ruby's face. "You took an incredible risk coming out here." "We couldn't sit at home knowing you might be riding into danger," Ruby replied simply. Something in Yates's expression shifted, a softening, a warmth that made Ruby's heart skip. Before he could respond, however, Harlan interrupted. "We need to get back to the marshal with this information," he reminded them, "and get these ladies to safety." "I'll escort them back to town," the deputy offered. "You two return to the marshal and help plan our next move." Yates shook his head. "I'll take the women back. You and Harlan know the terrain better than I do. The marshal will need that knowledge to outflank Thompson's position." After a brief discussion, this plan was agreed upon. Harlan and the deputy rode back to join the marshal, while Yates took the reins of the buggy for the return journey to town. As they traveled, he explained that the marshal had received intelligence that morning suggesting Thompson was planning to flee to Mexico, but wanted to eliminate his pursuers first. The marshal was suspicious of riding directly into the mine camp, Yates told them. "But we didn't know they had so many men or that they'd set such an elaborate trap." "What will happen now?" Caroline asked. "The marshal will likely pull back and request additional deputies from Springfield," Yates replied. "Or attempt to flank Thompson's position using the knowledge of the terrain that Harlan and some of the ranch hands have." Ruby had been quiet, watching Yates's profile as he spoke. Now she asked the question that had been worrying her most. "Will there be a fight?" Yates glanced at her, his expression softening. "Probably. Thompson and his men know they face prison at best if captured. They won't surrender easily." He reached over to briefly cover her hand with his. "But thanks to you three, at least it will be on our terms, not theirs." They reached Galesburg just as dusk was falling. The town was buzzing with rumors about the search for Thompson and his men, and their arrival caused quite a stir. Yates took them directly to the judge's house, where Mrs. Wilson was waiting anxiously. "Thank God you're safe," she exclaimed, ushering them inside. "I've been beside myself with worry." While Mrs. Barrett and Caroline explained what had happened, Yates drew Ruby aside into the judge's study. "I need to return to the marshal and the others," he said quietly. "But first, I want to make sure you'll be safe here." "I will be," Ruby assured him. "Mrs. Wilson has invited all of us to stay, and the judge's house is well protected." She hesitated, then added, "Please be careful, Yates. Thompson has everything to lose now that makes him even more dangerous." "I know," Yates acknowledged, "but we have the advantage now thanks to your warning." He took her hand, his thumb gently stroking across her knuckles. "Ruby, when this is over, there are things I want to say to you, things I should have said already." Ruby's heart quickened. "Then come back safely so you can say them." Impulsively, she rose on tiptoes and pressed a brief kiss to his cheek. Yates looked momentarily startled, then a slow smile spread across his face. Before he could respond, however, the study door opened, and Judge Wilson himself entered, having just returned from town. "Ah, Blackburn, good. Marshal Taylor sent me to gather additional men from town. He's planning to move on Thompson's position at dawn." The judge noticed their clasped hands but made no comment beyond a slight raising of his eyebrows. "I need you to help coordinate the volunteers." Yates reluctantly released Ruby's hand. "Of course, Your Honor. I'll head to the saloon first. Several reliable men were gathering there earlier." As he prepared to leave, Yates gave Ruby one last meaningful look. "Remember what I said when this is over." "I'll remember," Ruby promised. "Go safely." After Yates departed with the judge, Ruby joined the other women in the parlor. Mrs. Wilson provided them with a light supper, though none had much appetite given the circumstances. As the evening progressed, men from town began gathering at the judge's house, receiving instructions before heading north to join the marshal's forces. The night passed slowly, with little news beyond occasional reports that the marshal was surrounding the mine camp, cutting off all escape routes. Ruby tried to rest, but found sleep impossible. Instead, she sat by the window in her borrowed bedroom, watching the stars and praying for Yates's safety. Dawn broke with the distant sound of gunfire from the north. Ruby, who had finally dozed off in the early morning hours, jerked awake at the noise. Rushing to the window, she could see nothing beyond the town's limits, but the sporadic shots confirmed that the confrontation had begun. The hours that followed were agonizing. Reports trickled in from riders sent by the marshal. The initial assault had met with heavy resistance. One deputy had been wounded. Thompson and his men were barricaded in the mine office and refused to surrender. By mid-morning, the gunfire had intensified, then gradually tapered off. Around noon, a rider arrived with news that Thompson's position had been overrun. Several of his men had been killed or wounded, but Thompson himself and 3 others had escaped into the mine tunnels. The marshal and his forces, including Yates and Mr. Barrett, were in pursuit. This last news sent a chill through Ruby. The Sullivan mine had been abandoned years ago due to unstable tunnels and dangerous gas pockets. The thought of Yates pursuing desperate men through such hazardous conditions filled her with dread. It was late afternoon when the first wounded began arriving in town. Dr. Miller and his wife converted their home into a temporary hospital, treating men from both sides of the conflict. Ruby, Caroline, and Mrs. Barrett went to help, providing an extra pair of hands and comfort to the injured. As Ruby was bringing fresh water to a wounded deputy, the doctor's door burst open, and 2 men carried in a third between them. Ruby's heart nearly stopped when she recognized Yates, his face pale beneath a layer of coal dust, a bloody bandage wrapped around his left thigh. Yates, she gasped, rushing to his side. His eyes found hers, and despite his obvious pain, he managed a small smile. "It looks worse than it is," he assured her, his voice hoarse from dust. "Just a bullet graze and some bruises from a tunnel collapse." The men helped him onto an examination table, where Dr. Miller quickly cut away his torn trouser leg to assess the wound. Ruby held Yates's hand tightly as the doctor cleaned and properly bandaged the injury. "You're lucky," Dr. Miller pronounced. "Another inch to the right and you'd have lost the leg. As it is, you'll need to stay off it for at least a week." Yates grimaced. "No time for that, Doc. Thompson and Holloway are still in the tunnels. I need to get back." "You're not going anywhere," Ruby interrupted firmly. "The marshal has plenty of men for the search. You've done more than your share." Before Yates could protest further, the door opened again to admit the marshal himself, a tall, weathered man with a star-shaped badge on his dusty coat. He nodded respectfully to Ruby before addressing Yates. "Your lady's right, Blackburn. We've got the mine surrounded. No one's getting out without us knowing. And after what you did, saving Deputy Collins from that cave-in, you've earned a rest." Yates reluctantly subsided, though his expression remained frustrated. "What about Thompson?" "Still hiding somewhere in the mine," the marshal replied grimly. "But we found Becker and Holloway. Becker surrendered. Holloway didn't." The implication was clear. One more of Thompson's deputies would never face justice in a courtroom. After the marshal left, Ruby helped Yates move to a cot in a quieter corner of the doctor's makeshift ward. His exhaustion was evident, but he seemed reluctant to sleep, his mind still on the unfinished business at the mine. "You need rest," Ruby told him, gently wiping cold dust from his face with a damp cloth. "You've been awake for nearly 2 days straight." Yates caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. "I promised to come back to you," he said softly, "to tell you what I should have said before." Ruby's heart quickened. "You did come back, and you will have plenty of time to tell me, after you've rested." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Stay with me?" he asked, his voice betraying his vulnerability. "I'm not going anywhere," Ruby promised, settling into a chair beside his cot and keeping his hand in hers. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed him and Yates fell into a deep sleep. Ruby remained at his side, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, overwhelmed with relief that he had returned alive, if not unscathed. Hours passed. The doctor's house gradually emptied as the less seriously wounded were released to recover at home or in the hotel. Caroline brought Ruby a tray of food and offered to take her place, but Ruby declined, unwilling to leave Yates even for a moment. Night had fallen when Yates finally stirred, his eyes opening to find Ruby still beside him, her head resting on the edge of his cot where she had dozed off, still holding his hand. "Ruby," he whispered, gently stroking her hair. She woke instantly, raising her head to meet his gaze. "How do you feel?" "Better," he said, pushing himself up to a sitting position with only a slight wince. "Has there been any news?" Ruby nodded. "They found Thompson about an hour ago. He was trying to escape through an old air shaft at the far end of the mine. The marshal has him in custody now." Relief washed over Yates's face. "So it's over." "It's over," Ruby confirmed. "The marshal says he has more than enough evidence to ensure Thompson and his remaining men will spend many years in prison. And Judge Wilson is already making arrangements for a special election to choose a permanent sheriff." Yates nodded, then surprised Ruby by swinging his legs over the side of the cot. "I need to get out of here," he said, reaching for his boots which someone had placed nearby. "Yates, the doctor said you need to stay off that leg for a week," Ruby protested. "I've had worse injuries breaking horses," he assured her, "and I need fresh air and privacy for what I have to say to you." Despite Ruby's concerns, Yates was determined. With her reluctant assistance, he pulled on his boots and stood, testing his weight gingerly on the injured leg. It clearly pained him, but he could walk with only a slight limp. "Just to the porch," Ruby insisted. "No further." The night air was cool and refreshing after the close atmosphere of the doctor's house. Stars blanketed the sky, and the town was quiet, most citizens having retired early after the excitement of the day. Yates guided Ruby to a bench at the far end of the porch, where they could speak without being overheard by anyone inside. "Ruby," he began, taking both her hands in his. "These past days have been the most dangerous I've experienced since leaving Texas. But they've also brought me something I never expected to find in Galesburg, something I'd almost given up hoping for." Ruby's heart thundered in her chest as Yates continued, his green eyes never leaving hers. "When I saw Holloway dragging you through the street, something in me broke open. Not just anger at the injustice, but something deeper, a recognition, maybe, of a spirit that matched my own in ways I hadn't thought possible." He squeezed her hands gently. "And every moment since has only confirmed what I felt in that first instant." "And what was that?" Ruby asked softly, though she hoped she knew the answer. "That you were someone I could love," Yates said simply. "Someone I already was beginning to love without even realizing it." Joy blossomed in Ruby's chest, warm and radiant. "I felt it too," she admitted. "Even in the midst of fear and danger, something about you called to me. Your strength, your integrity, your kindness." Yates released one of her hands to gently touch her cheek. "I'm not a wealthy man, Ruby. Everything I have is from my work at the Circle B. But I can offer you a good life, a safe home, and a heart that will cherish you until my dying day." "Are you proposing to me, Yates Blackburn?" Ruby asked, a smile curving her lips despite the tears that had begun to gather in her eyes. "I am," he confirmed, his own smile appearing. "Probably too soon by most standards, and certainly not in the way I'd planned. I'm covered in cold dust and blood, and we're sitting on Dr. Miller's porch in the middle of the night." Ruby laughed softly. "I don't care about any of that. After what we've been through together, conventional courtship seems rather beside the point, doesn't it?" "It does," Yates agreed, growing serious again. "But I want to do this properly." With visible effort, he slid from the bench to one knee before her, wincing slightly as his injured leg protested. "Ruby Keller, will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Ruby didn't hesitate. "Yes, Yates. With all my heart, yes." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, then deepening with all the emotion they had held in check during the dangerous days just past. When they finally separated, both were breathless, and Yates's eyes had darkened with a passion that sent a thrill through Ruby. "I should get you back inside before Dr. Miller comes looking for his missing patient," she said, though she made no move to rise. Yates smiled, reclaiming his place beside her on the bench. "In a minute. I want to remember this moment exactly as it is, the stars, the quiet night, and you beside me, having just made me the happiest man in Illinois." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, planning their future in quiet murmurs, a small wedding at the Barrett Ranch once Ruby's shop was restored. A home of their own eventually, perhaps on a corner of Circle B land that Mr. Barrett had once offered Yates. Children, someday, who would grow up knowing both their parents' love and the values of courage and integrity that had brought them together. The days that followed were busy with rebuilding not just Ruby's shop, but the town's sense of security and justice after Thompson's corrupt reign. True to the community's promise, volunteers helped restore Keller's millinery and fine goods to its former charm, with many contributing materials or labor to replace what had been destroyed. The special election was held 3 weeks later, with Harlan winning by a substantial majority. Under his leadership, and with the territorial marshal's continued support, law and order returned to Galesburg. The businesses that had fled during Thompson's time began to return, including a new newspaper established by a young journalist from Springfield who was determined to ensure transparency in local government. Ruby and Yates were married on a perfect June day at the Barrett Ranch, with Judge Wilson officiating and what seemed like half the county in attendance. Caroline served as Ruby's maid of honor, while Mr. Barrett stood as Yates's best man, having been more of a father to him than a mere employer for most of his life. As they exchanged vows beneath an arch of flowers in the Barrett's garden, Ruby thought back to that terrible day when Holloway had dragged her through the streets of Galesburg. What had seemed like the worst day of her life had, in fact, been the beginning of the best. The day Yates Blackburn had stepped between her and danger, saying those simple words that changed everything. Touch her again. After the ceremony, as guests enjoyed the lavish reception Mrs. Barrett had arranged, Yates led his new bride away for a moment of privacy in the rose garden. "Mrs. Blackburn," he said, the name a caress on his lips. "Are you happy?" Ruby's answer was in her radiant smile as she reached up to touch his beloved face. "Completely. And you?" "More than I ever thought possible," Yates replied honestly. "When I came to your rescue that day, I had no idea I was really rescuing myself from loneliness, from a life half-lived." "We rescued each other," Ruby corrected him gently, "and will continue to do so, I expect, for many years to come." Yates's arms tightened around her. "That's a promise I'm happy to make." He kissed her then, sealing their commitment beneath the boundless prairie sky, their future stretching before them as wide and promising as the western horizon. 5 years later, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the front porch of the Blackburn home as Ruby rocked gently, her 3-year-old son James asleep in her lap while she watched her daughter Emma chase butterflies in the front yard. At 5 years old, Emma had her mother's auburn hair and her father's determined spirit, a combination that filled Ruby with both pride and occasional exasperation. The sound of hoofbeats announced Yates's return from town. Emma abandoned her butterfly hunt to race toward her father as he dismounted. Yates scooped her up with practiced ease, tossing her into the air before settling her on his hip. "And how's my butterfly girl today?" he asked, carrying her toward the porch. "I caught 3, Papa," Emma announced proudly, "but Mama made me let them go." "Very wise of Mama," Yates approved, climbing the porch steps to bend and kiss his wife hello. "And how's our little cowboy?" he added, gently touching his sleeping son's cheek. "Finally napping after refusing all morning," Ruby replied with a smile. "How was town?" Yates settled into the chair beside her, keeping Emma on his lap. "Busy. The railroad station is nearly complete. They're saying the first train will arrive next month." He reached into his pocket and produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I brought you something." Ruby shifted James carefully to accept the package. Inside was a beautiful silver locket on a delicate chain. "Yates, it's lovely," she said, opening it to find miniature photographs of Emma and James already placed inside. "To celebrate 5 wonderful years," he explained. "Though no gift could truly express what you and our children mean to me." Ruby's eyes softened with love. "Having you and our family is all the gift I need." She glanced around at their home, the sturdy 2-story house Yates had built with his own hands on land given to them as a wedding present by the Barretts. "We've created something beautiful here, haven't we?" "We have," Yates agreed, following her gaze to take in their prospering farm. In addition to his continued work as foreman at the Circle B, Yates had developed their own land into a successful horse breeding operation, while Ruby still managed her millinery shop in town 3 days a week, having trained 2 young women as assistants. "And there's room for more," Yates added with a meaningful look at his wife. "If you're feeling up to it, that is." Ruby's hand drifted to her abdomen, where the first subtle signs of their third child had recently made themselves known. "I think our family isn't quite complete yet," she agreed with a smile. Emma looked up at her parents curiously. "More butterflies coming," Yates laughed and hugged his daughter closer. "Something even better than butterflies, sweetheart, but that's a surprise for another day." He stood, shifting Emma to his shoulders. "Now, who's going to help me feed the new foal before dinner?" As her husband and daughter headed toward the barn, James still sleeping peacefully in her arms, Ruby watched them go with a heart full of contentment. From the terror of being dragged through the streets of Galesburg to this moment of perfect happiness, it had been quite a journey. She thought briefly of Sheriff Thompson, still serving his prison sentence in Springfield, and Deputy Holloway, who had died in the mine that day rather than face justice. Their cruelty had inadvertently led to her greatest joy, a paradox that still amazed her. The sun was setting now, painting the prairie in gold and amber. In the distance, Ruby could see the spire of Galesburg's new church and the smoke from evening fires rising from town chimneys. The community had thrived in the years since Thompson's defeat, growing and prospering under fair leadership. And at the heart of her own happiness was Yates, her protector, her partner, her love. The cowboy who had stepped between her and danger on that fateful day and never left her side since. As if sensing her thoughts, Yates glanced back from the barnyard and smiled that special smile he reserved only for her. Ruby returned it, lifting her free hand in a small wave of acknowledgement. No words were needed. The bond between them spoke volumes in the simple gesture. Life in the West was never easy or entirely safe. There would always be challenges to face, storms to weather. But together,